The first school Reg and Bev visited was Sacred Heart College in Johannesburg. Reg was worried that OBE placed too much emphasis on learners and relegated the teacher's role to that of a mere facilitator. He agreed that teachers should be more learner-centred, but also felt quite strongly that they were employed to teach their subject and not simply coordinate groups or hand out crayons. I suggested he speak to Heather Blankensee, a biology teacher at Sacred Heart, to see whether traditional methods still have a place in OBE classrooms.
The lecture method or that traditional approach has its place for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is, in fact, you cannot every single lesson have the students sort of group working and that kind of thing, simply because you have, it involves a lot of preparation. And so there are times when the teacher just needs a timeout.
Good morning, class. We're going to spend a little bit of time learning about the basic unit that makes up our body.
It's also, if you have a discipline issue with the class, you can tend to lose control with group work. And so it can be a way of the teacher just taking control again of that class, establishing some kind of authority in the class, and she can then move back and a more relaxed approach with her class.
So Heather was very clear that the lecture method does have a role to play in current education. For instance, it can be used as a good management tool, as a timeout from the intensity of group work, or else as a means to regain control of your class. But as Heather warns, it has its weaknesses, and it needs to be used imaginatively. One needs to use good questioning to engage in learners' interests. We need to draw on learners' experiences and their own knowledge while we are teaching.
What are the weaknesses that you find when you use that approach?
The students are simply focusing on content. So they are passive receptors in that context. If the teacher does not actively engage them and ask them questions, ask them to actually grapple with the content that they are learning.
So let's take a look at that and see if we can identify the different structures that are associated with that. We call this big balloon-shaped thing a vacuole.
And you've got to avoid actually allowing the teacher to become the only expert in the classroom in that situation. You have to invite the students to share what they already know about the particular topic, because students bring into the classroom a lot of experience and knowledge.
Okay, good question. What does DNA stand for? Does anybody know what DNA stands for? Hands up. Okay, well done, Tamela. All right, deoxyribonucleic acid. So what are those sausage-shaped structures called, Yumna? Mitochondria.
So although Heather argues that the old transmission style of education does have a role to play, she also suggests that our society is changing in ways which makes new styles of teaching absolutely essential. For instance, children need to be able to think, to problem solve, to work collaboratively. And I think this requires a move towards things like group work and project work, and also independent study.
I want you please to get into groups of 6.
Group work has a place in the classroom. The students find it interesting. It's an opportunity for them to engage with one another. They're also learning not just the information of the class, but they're actually engaging with one another and learning social skills.
Well, it would be under the beginning of it if it's the building blocks of life. So it has to be under the beginning.
Your brighter students, your more able students will take the task, get on with it. They will have the skills to allow them to grapple with the material and to move forward.
Have you chosen a group leader? Yes. Okay. Now, this is what the task is. You guys are, first of all, you have to find out what is the basic unit of your body.
The cell is bounded by a thin cell membrane. Okay. In the center is a tiny ball, the nucleus. This is surrounded by a material called the cytoplasm.
But Heather warns group work can be very badly used, and it is threatening to many teachers.
Your weaker students or your less able students may feel intimidated by the task. They may not want to engage with the task for whatever reason, and so often they then tend to treat it as a free period.
No, not Benny McCarthy. Hi, Dean.
But it's also not an excuse for teachers to have a free period. Good teachers like Heather, for instance, manage their classes. They keep an eye on what groups are doing and intervene where there are problems.
I wish I was there with you.
No, we drew.
Okay, guys, what's happening here? Who's your group leader?
Jessica, no, I'm not.
Another weakness is, as a teacher, if you are used to being the center of the class and being the knowledge expert, it's quite hard to relinquish that control. And when you've got each group doing something different or progressing at a different pace, you can have that feeling that you're actually losing control.
All right, grade 10s, can I have your attention, please?
But I think that if you know that you've got your task fairly clearly structured and the students know what is expected of them and what at the end of that task they need to have achieved, then it works particularly well. What outcomes-based education is really all about is where you have the students interacting in a group work situation, they're recognizing that their peers have knowledge to share, that they have some kind of structure, and there will be at the end of it some kind of outcome.
Not only does Heather use a number of different teaching methods in a lesson, but she also draws on the real-life experiences of her students.
I want you to choose a product, and then I want you to design a factory that is going to manufacture your particular product.
She called this method critical mediation.
Let's get on with it.
It was a method which drew on pupils' knowledge of things that are familiar to them, but then built on that in a very structured way to more complex understandings of something like the cell.
And then you're going to present your factory to the rest of the class. You're going to tell them about your product. You're going to tell them about what your factory has. Remember, you're working in groups. You have to choose your group leader, and each of you has to be actively involved in helping with this particular design.
Heather has chosen the factory because it is a concept familiar to students. And as the students discover, factory production is similar to the workings of the human cell.
All right, now why do you think a factory needs to have security?
To protect it from
To protect it from what?
thieves, losing anything.
Okay, to protect them from thieves, losing anything. Now, that kind of security, what kind of security system should it be?
Heather gives groups clear instructions and engages with learners as they work. She asks difficult questions, constantly pushing students into more and more complex ways of thinking.
Now, if you've got all this barbed wire and fencing, how are the people going to get in and out of this fence?
Security.
Learners work together to produce a plan of the imaginary factory, which they must then explain to the class.
So all the material comes in here to the storeroom. That's where it's kept. And then where the actual work starts, it goes for cutting.
Heather then uses a fairly traditional question and answer session to link familiar factory concepts to unfamiliar biological concepts.
What were other common features that you found in all of the designs of the factory? Catherine?
Workers.
Okay, we've got workers, very important because they're the guys who are actually going to assemble a lot of the products in our factory. TC?
Machinery.
Excellent, machinery. Now I'm sure you're asking yourself, what on earth has this factory design got to do with biology? We've spent 2 days looking at our factories, designing the products, and the question in your minds is, what has this got to do with biology? Well, let's see if we can figure it out. The cell, the basic unit of every single living organism, is like a huge big factory, a chemical factory. And the different structures that we find in our basic factory, we find in the cell.
I thought that lesson worked superbly. Because of Heather's excellent planning and the very clever way in which she drew on the sort of knowledge that students already had about factories to build more sophisticated understandings of the cell, I think her lesson never descended into chaos. But I think what's even more interesting about her lesson is she demonstrates just how active teachers still are. It was her with her students who were actively engaged in developing far more sophisticated understandings of biology and of the human cell. And that is what a critical mediator does. Interestingly, Heather's methodology, where she uses a mix of methods to teach both basic knowledge and critical thinking skills, isn't new. As Tim Medisa tells us, he had a teacher that did this 20 years ago.
If he was a form of technology, I would say he was interactive multimedia kind of person, because he used all sorts of tricks to get us going. and also encouraged us to think for ourselves. You know, if for example, you were not confident enough in the work that we were doing, that we were in written work or in articulated work, he would take us through the paces, teach us the rudimentary elements or fundamentals of English grammar, for example, but still encourage us to go and read on our own so that we expanded the knowledge we had. He was a good storyteller, and also make sure that we taught each other through him, if you will.
We taught each other through him. I think that's a wonderful description of a critical mediator. I imagine a teacher who, like Heather, does all the fundamentals really well, encourages students to think and to discuss, but then also creates an enthusiasm in them which makes them go away and want to learn more. Tim was also describing a teacher who had a real passion for his subject, something that Heather believes is absolutely essential to good teaching.
I don't believe a teacher can actually teach without loving her subject. She really needs to enjoy what she's doing. And if you have a passion for your subject and a natural curiosity, what you will do is you will then find each year a new angle, and you will communicate that passion to your students.
So love for your subject and your work is an essential part of being a good knowledge worker. But your work doesn't end there. It continues because children learn after they leave your classroom.